Okay, well let's go ahead and get started. Today what we're going to do is we're going to go through the rest of the accessory organs of the digestive system. We talked about the liver on Friday, and we went over the duct system that drains the liver. I want to briefly review that again and add one more thing to this diagram up here that I didn't mention on Friday. And then we're going to go through the rest of the digestive tract. So we should be able to finish up this chapter today. Wednesday we'll do the male reproductive system. And then the last 2 days we'll go over the female reproductive system. We've already had a good head start on both male and female reproductive systems because we've already done that, and we've already done the anatomy in lab, so it's mostly just looking at the physiology. Okay? All right. So, just to briefly review, because I went over this right near the end of class on Friday, and I kind of tell that some of you were getting a little antsy to get out of here, and so I don't know how much you were paying attention to it. So let's just go over this again, and I want to add one more thing to this that actually I think is kind of incorrect on this diagram. So up here at the top, this is where the liver would be sitting, okay? And these two small ducts right here called the hepatic ducts, those collect the bile that's produced by the liver, okay? Those hepatic ducts then come together to form the common hepatic duct, all right? And then the common hepatic duct is joined by the cystic duct, which is not, it's not labeled on here. Oh yeah, it is. Here's the cystic duct right here. Cystic duct is what drains the gallbladder. Gallbladder stores bile when it's not needed. And so where the cystic duct, which is right here, comes together with the common hepatic duct, that forms what's usually called the common bile duct. Now on here, for some reason, they're just calling it the bile duct, but most commonly it's the common bile duct. Now, to further add confusion, sometimes it's difficult for people that are interpreting x-rays or scans of the duct system to tell exactly where the common hepatic duct ends and where the common bile duct begins. And so sometimes they also refer to the common hepatic duct as the bile duct. All right, but technically that's the common hepatic duct, and this is the common bile duct. Now, the common bile duct then is joined by the pancreatic duct that drains the pancreas closer to the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. And where these two ducts come together, that forms a passageway called hepatopancreatic ampulla. And right at the very end of the hepatopancreatic ampulla is a ring of smooth muscle called the hepatopancreatic sphincter. And that controls the flow of the fluids from the pancreas, which is called pancreatic juice, as well as bile from the liver. Okay. Now, when there isn't any fat in the small intestine, this hepatopancreatic, so in other words, if you haven't eaten for a long time, let's say it's been 5 or 6 hours since you've had a meal, there's probably not going to be much food in the small intestine. So you don't need bile. You don't need the pancreatic juice that contains the enzymes to digest the food. Then this hepatopancreatic sphincter contracts, closes that off. And so what happens is that since the liver produces bile continuously, bile continues to flow down, but if that's blocked, then pressure starts to build up in this common bile duct. When that pressure starts building up, then what happens is the bile backs up into the gallbladder where the bile is stored, okay? And so it's stored there until it's needed. When that hepatopancreatic ampulla opens up, then bile is able to flow into the small intestine, and it helps to break down big fat droplets into smaller fat droplets. Okay? Any questions? All right. So the next accessory organ is the gallbladder. I've already talked about it quite a bit. It's a pear-shaped organ located on the underside of the right lobe, right kind of between the right lobe and the quadrate lobe. Its primary function is to store bile. It's drained by the cystic duct, which drains into the common bile duct. Gallstones can sometimes form in the gallbladder from cholesterol, either cholesterol, carbonate, and a compound called bilirubin. And gallbladders can be extremely painful, and they can cause jaundice when they obstruct the bile duct. And gallstones are most common in women over 40. And there's a saying, and I didn't make this up, so I'm not the one to blame, but there's a saying in the medical profession that the people that are most susceptible to gallbladder have the 4 F's of gallbladder disease. And those 4 F's are female, fatty, 40, and fertile. Those four words make a person more susceptible to gallbladders. And so it's not uncommon then, if a person has severe gallbladder disease, just to remove the gallbladder. Okay? I know people that have had that done. You can survive without a gallbladder. You're just not going to be able to store as much bile, and so you have to be careful not to eat too much fatty foods, because that can cause, since you can't store bile without a gallbladder, you're not going to be able to release as much bile at one time to break down the fat. So if you eat too much fat, then you get indigestion. All right, then the next accessory organ is the pancreas, which is both an endocrine gland, which helps regulate blood sugar by secreting insulin and glucagon. But with respect to the digestive system, the pancreas is an exocrine organ. An exocrine organ is a gland that releases secretions through a duct, like the salivary glands that are associated with the oral cavity. And so the pancreas the pancreas has one main pancreatic duct that carries bicarbonate and also a number of different digestive enzymes into the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. The bicarbonate helps to neutralize the stomach acid, so the stomach acid doesn't eat its way through the walls of the small intestine, and the digestive enzymes help to chemically break down the food. Okay. Now, in some people, there is a secondary or accessory pancreatic duct. And in some people, that accessory pancreatic duct has an opening into the small intestine, into the duodenum. So some people, there's actually 2 routes for that pancreatic juice to make its way into the duodenum. But in other people, there is no connection to the small intestine with the accessory pancreatic duct. And so because the usual route for pancreatic juice is to go through the the main pancreatic duct. So you don't really need that. The reason that some people have that connection between the accessory pancreatic duct and the duodenum is because of the way the pancreas develops. And this is one reason why taking a course on embryology or human embryology is helpful in understanding adult anatomy. Because early on in development, the pancreas actually develops from two outgrowths of the midgut of the embryo. There's one little outgrowth of the midgut, which eventually becomes part of it becomes the duodenum. There's one on the dorsal side called the dorsal pancreatic rudiment. And there's one on the ventral side called the ventral pancreatic rudiment. And another thing that happens during development is as these organs are developing, the midgut of the embryo rotates. And when the midgut rotates, the dorsal pancreatic rudiment moves around and it actually fuses with the ventral pancreatic rudiment to form the pancreas. Well, since those two rudiments started out connected to the duodenum, that connection is what forms these pancreatic ducts. When the dorsal pancreatic rudiment fuses with the ventral pancreatic rudiment, that creates that accessory pancreatic duct. In some people, it closes off, so there's no connection with the duodenum. In other people, it remains open. So either way, you still have the main pancreatic. I think the main pancreatic duct actually develops from the ventral pancreatic rudiment. In any event, it's probably beneficial if you have an accessory pancreatic duct because it provides an alternative route for that pancreatic juice to make its way down into the intestine. And that could be important in some situations, like if a person were to unfortunately get pancreatic cancer, which is one of the more serious forms of cancer. It's difficult to treat, it's often fatal. If you had a tumor growing down here and it were to block the pancreatic duct, there'd still be a route for there'd be an alternative route. The pancreatic juice could get into your duodenum. So that might make the quality of life of that person a little bit better, before it spreads and causes other problems. But otherwise, it's just an anatomical curiosity. And if you didn't study embryology, which some of you may do if you go on into a medical profession like medical school, you wouldn't know why that exists. But once you look at how embryos develop, that helps understand why that's there. There's a lot of things in anatomy that are like that. Just like there's a opening between the right and left atrium in human embryos. And at birth, that opening closes off. But in some people, that opening actually stays open, even into their adult life. But because of the pressure differences, there's a flap of tissue that covers up that opening. It's called the foramen ovale. And so some people as adults have what's called a pro-patent foramen ovale. And if you do an autopsy on someone that has that, you can actually push a blunt probe from the left atrium into the right atrium. But unless you do an autopsy or some other scan, that person would never know that they had that condition. And unless you take a course in human embryology, you wouldn't know why some people have that opening between the right and left. It doesn't cause any problems, but nonetheless there is a hole there. All right. So the pancreas produces about 1,200 to 1.5, or 1,200 to 1,500 milliliters of pancreatic juice per day. And pancreatic juice contains Water, it contains inactive enzymes called zymogens. Pancreatic amylase, which can continue the breakdown of starch. Pancreatic lipase, which breaks down triglycerides. Deoxyribonuclease, which breaks down DNA. Ribonuclease, which breaks down RNA. There's always RNA and DNA in any food that we eat. Bicarbonate, which as I said before, helps to break down hydrochloric acid from the stomach, and other electrolytes. So bicarbonate neutralizes HCl from the stomach. Amylase continues the breakdown of starch. Remember, there's salivary amylase that's produced by the salivary glands that begins the process of the breakdown of starch even before you swallow your food. Lipase breaks down lipids. Like I said, deoxyribonuclease and ribonuclease break down DNA and RNA respectively. And zymogens, which are inactive enzymes, those are converted into active proteolytic enzymes, which then break down protein. All right, so those are the accessory organs. Now we're going to continue on down the digestive tract. So the next part of the digestive tract after the stomach, are the next, I should say, parts, are collectively called the small intestines. Small intestines are named for their small diameter, not their length. And small intestines carry out nearly all of the chemical digestions of food and also most of the absorption of nutrients. And the small intestines range from 2.7 to 4.5 meters in a living person, but much longer in a deceased person or a cadaver. Now, there are three different divisions of the small intestine. Other than their relative positions, you can't really distinguish these three divisions externally. But if you have a reference point, like where the small intestine connects to the stomach, then you know that first part of the small intestine, that's the duodenum. But externally, if you were to straighten out the small intestines, you wouldn't be able to tell which was which unless you knew where the ends were connected. So the first 10 inches is called the duodenum. The next 1 to 1.7 meters is the jejunum. That's the second longest part of the small intestines. And the longest part of the small intestine, which is the most distal part, is called the ileum. And notice that this part of the small intestine is spelled with an E, not with an I. If you replace the E with an I, then you're talking about one of the bones of the pelvis and not part of the digestive system. So that's a good example of where spelling is important, okay? You're a medical transcriptionist and you misspell that with an I instead of talking about the disorder of the ileum, you'd be talking about something wrong with the pelvis. Now, even though these all look the same, except for the relative positions externally, there are some internal differences. And in fact, if you look at a cross-section through the small intestine, you can tell which part it came from by looking for specific structures that are in the submucosa of the small intestines. So, for example, if you look at a cross-section of the duodenum, the submucosa of the duodenum, and this is kind of hard to see because they're so small. But the submucosa of the duodenum, which is this layer right here, is just packed full of glandular tissue. There are little glands that are cut in cross-section. These glands are called duodenal glands. Those duodenal glands secrete enzymes into the duodenum. None of the other two regions of the small intestine have those duodenal glands in the submucosa. Then the jejunum, which is the middle part and the second longest part of the small intestine, its submucosa just has your typical connective tissue and blood vessels. So the jejunum really doesn't have any specialized features in the submucosa. It just looks like your typical submucosa. Okay, but in the duodenum has numerous glands in the submucosa, so it has a very, very different appearance. And then if you look at a cross section through the ileum has large patches that stain darker purple. And these dark purple patches are called mesenteric patches or Peyer's patches. These mesenteric patches are actually clusters of lymphocytes. So this is this patch of lymphocyte makes up a lymphoid tissue. It's called a lymphoid tissue. It's not an organ because it's not surrounded by connective tissue. So this is just a big collection of lymphocytes, like B cells and T cells, and they play a role in monitoring the bacteria that's in our digestive tract. And so you'll see these mesenteric patches in the submucosa of the ileum. They're also found in the appendix and also in the cecum. All right, now the small intestines also have 4 different adaptations that function to increase the surface area available for absorption. Because the rate of diffusion through a semi-permeable barrier, one of the factors that affects that is the cross-sectional area. So the more area you have for diffusion, the faster the rate of transport. And the more area you have for transport proteins. One of the adaptations is found on the inside of the small intestine is circular ridges. And you can only see this from the lumen of the small intestine. There are circular spiral ridges of the mucosa and submucosa, and that helps to increase the surface area for absorption. It's kind of the same reason why our cerebrum has convolutions. By being convoluted, there's more room for neurons, increases the surface area of the cerebrum. Also, in the submucosa and the mucosa of the small intestine, there are little finger-like extensions that extend out into the lumen called villi. So villi are finger-like folds. They contain capillaries that absorb nutrients, as well as blind, microscopic, lymphatic capillaries. They're called lacteals in those villi. The lacteals absorb lipids. And then, if you look under very, very high magnification on the surface of the villi, you'll see what looks like little hair-like appendages on the luminal surface of the columnar cells. Those little hair-like structures are called microvilli, and they're actually folds of the cell membrane of the columnar cells that line the small intestine. And again, those microvilli just function to increase the surface area available for transport. And these microvilli form what's called a brush border, because it looks sort of like the bristles of a brush under a microscope. And that brush border actually has enzymes embedded in the membrane. And those enzymes can break down, can help break down food in a process that's known as contact digestion. It's called contact digestion because those enzymes aren't released into the lumen, they're just found and they're embedded in the membrane. So any food molecules are in contact with that membrane then can be partially digested. So here's a picture showing some of these adaptations. So this is a cross section through part of the small intestine. And you can see these little ridges on the inside that are circular. Those are called the plicae circulares. And those ridges are just folds that increase the surface area. And then if you look at it more closely under magnification, you can see these little finger-like projections, even on the plicae circulares. Those are villi. In fact, here's a more highly magnified villus. Villus is the singular form of the word villi. And again, that just functions to increase the surface area available for absorption. And then if you were to look at it under an electron microscope, then you can see the microvilli. So there's several different levels at which the surface area of the small intestine is, and that's a characteristic that you're going to find in any kind of surface where transport of molecules are going to occur. You're going to see adaptations for absorption. All right, then the next part of the digestive system is the large intestine. What happens in the large intestine? What processes go on there?
Digestive?
Most of that happens in the, well, that's true in a broad sense, but in a more narrow sense, most of the chemical digestion occurs in the small intestine, and most of the absorption occurs in the small intestine.
Isn't it for expulsion of unneeded materials?
That's one function. Propulsion of basically undigestible material. Okay. There's two other functions that occur there. One of them is compaction of wastes, and that occurs as a result of the propulsion of wastes. And then also there's some absorption of water. The absorption of water consolidates the feces, makes the feces more firm. Okay. Now, the large intestine is kind of looped around the small intestine. And the reason it's looped around the small intestine, again, has to do with the way the digestive system develops in the early embryo. Because the intestine of the embryo rotates, which is what causes the two pancreatic rudiments to come together and fuse. When that rotates, the large intestine gets looped around the small intestines. All right. Now, the large intestine has several different regions that are named. Right at the junction between the small intestine, right here, here's the small intestine, and the large intestine, there's an ileocecal valve. It's just really kind of a flap of tissue, and that helps to control the movement of the food from the small intestine into the large intestine. And then right at the very beginning of the large intestine, there's kind of a little pouch-like area. It's a blind sac. That blind sac is called a cecum, and attached to the cecum is the appendix. The appendix is thought to be just a rudiment of a larger cecum that the ancestors of humans once had. Okay? And if you look at animals that are strict vegetarians, like herbivores, they tend to have a real, well, some of them, most of them do. They have a very large cecum. And that cecum contains microorganisms that help break down cellulose. So herbivores like horses have a large cecum, and they're microbes called symbionts or symbiotic organisms, and they live in there and they help break down the cellulose. We don't usually eat grass. We can't eat cellulose, so we don't really need a large cecum. So we just have a remnant of it that's called the appendix. And the appendix does get infected sometimes. There is some lymphoid tissue in the walls of the appendix, which may help fight infection, but sometimes it'll get infected anyway. And if the appendix ruptures, then that infection can spread, and it can be very, very life-threatening. So usually if someone gets appendicitis, which is a sign that you've got an infection of the appendix, usually they go in, they do an appendectomy. They just remove it. And it generally doesn't cause any major problems once that's removed. All right. Then the next part of the large intestine is called the ascending colon, because the chyme, which is the partially digested food, moves upward in a superior direction, so that's the ascending direction. So this section here is the ascending colon. Then you have the transverse colon up here. And then you have a descending colon, and then a sigmoid colon. So there are 4 different regions of the large intestine. In addition, there are 2 points where the large intestine is bent at a steep angle. One of them is on the right-hand side. That's called the right colic flexure, or it's also known as the hepatic flexure. And then over on the left side, you have the left colic flexure. That's also known as the splenic flexure, because the spleen is on that side. And then externally, on all parts of the large intestine, there are some typical structures that you can see on the outside. One of them is there's a longitudinal band of smooth muscle you can see in the middle of the large intestine. Those bands are called taenia coli, and they're just simply bands of smooth muscle. They help to produce the peristaltic contractions that move the chyme through the large intestine. And then typically there are little fat globules that are attached to the large intestine. And those are sometimes called epiploic appendages. They look like little appendages of fat that hang off of the large intestine. And that just contains fat, which is a storage area for lipids. Okay. All right. Then the next part of the large intestine is the anal canal. The anal canal is a passageway for feces. And one of the features you can see on the inside, the first part is the rectum, and then this part down here is the anal canal. One feature you can see in the rectum are, again, circular ridges on the inside, but in the rectum they're called rectal folds. Anybody guess what the function of those is? They actually mention this in your textbook, in chapter 25. They have an important function. And it's not just to keep you from pooping your pants. That's not, well, it probably helps that too. But Well, if you read your textbook, it actually says, and I'm not making this up, these rectal folds allow you to pass gas without pooping your pants. It allows you to retain feces while expelling gas. Okay. And then the last part is the anal canal, which then leads to the anus, which is the opening to the digestive tract. So in the anus, there are ridges. They're called anal columns. And in between the anal columns, you have a recess. It's called the anal sinus. And then, of course, you've got the external anal sphincter on the outside that allows you to have bowel control. All right. Well, let's do a review question next. Activate this. So, what's the name for the longest part of the small intestine? I'll give you a hint. The longest part is the most distal part of the small intestine. And it's the region that has mesenteric patches in the submucosa. Okay, I think everybody's answered now. So most of you said the ileum after I gave you a couple of hints, and that is correct. Whoops. There we go. That's the correct answer. It's the ileum. Okay, so which region of the small intestine has mesenteric patches or Peyer's patches? These mesenteric patches, by the way, I believe you can only see them in a stained cross-section. Said ileum, and that is correct again. Which of the following regions of the small intestine is not completely surrounded by a serosa? Serosa would be that outermost layer, small intestine. I don't think I mentioned this. said duodenum. And why is that? Why is the duodenum not completely surrounded by a serosa? How did you know that was the correct answer? Well, the reason it's not completely surrounded by a serosa is because the duodenum is retroperitoneal. Okay. So it's behind the parietal peritoneum, or superficial to the parietal peritoneum. And so it doesn't, that portion that's retroperitoneal isn't completely surrounded by it. The serosa is also, it's just another name for the visceral peritoneum. All right, so this is something we went over just today. Which duct carries bile most directly into the duodenum? Right, let's take a look. Oh, it's close. We almost have a four-way tie here. So if you looked at that diagram of the duct system that drains the liver and the pancreas, you'll see the last part is the hepatopancreatic ampulla. That's what empties into the duodenum. All right, so right here, this duct right here, that's labeled as the hepatopancreatic ampulla. Okay. All right, well, it's not time for us to stop, but I didn't think we'd get through this so quickly today, even though I went off on a couple of tangents. But, so let's stop here, and then we'll start the female reproductive system on Wednesday.
We don't have to do it tomorrow after micro either. We can do it. I don't care when we do it. You want to say hi? That's good enough. No.